Um, Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great, actually, that Kike, who is a former ODI colleague, has invited me to reflect here how ODI has changed, which means, at least to those of us who have been part of the story of ODI, it's apparent that we have changed. And so I'm going to try and share a little bit of this story of change that we've embarked upon over the past few years. Let me start by reflecting on what's happening around us. I think, the sector, if you want to call it that I and many of the people in this room have worked in for decades, call it developmentalism, for, want of a better word, it's going at best through a really full-blown identity crisis. Now, it's not a story of shrinking a budget, as many people, would like it to be, or the latest dip in project pipelines. It's much deeper than that. It's really existential. And we at ODI Global now really saw this happening a few years ago. So when we set our latest strategy that has just come to an end, in 2021, and it was 21 because, COVID, the first year, became short, it became 4 years instead of 5. I think we saw that, the shifts that were happening around us, and we set the strategy to accompany these shifts and really making sure that the organization would evolve, recognizing what was happening around us. So the keynote is called Beyond Budgets, and that is precisely the point. The point that started with our strategy, because we felt that, today, impact doesn't follow money. It follows clarity, it follows courage, and it follows willingness to change. And actually, I was thinking, I've been in the UK far too long, because now I also do 3 things by sea, as most Brits do. But it is, it happened by mistake, by chance. But honestly, as I was reflecting, it really was around clarity, around courage, and around really this willingness to change. And so that's the question really I want to explore with all of you. How can think tanks like ODI Global and like, all the think tanks that you represent here, really play a meaningful role in shaping change, in shaping the future, especially when the ground beneath us is shifting so fast. So for us at ODI Global, the journey began with, a really uncomfortable realization. The structures, the assumptions, the relationships that defined our past really no longer served the world that we claimed to be working for. So we had to make this shift, right? We moved from project-based funding. We moved from a constant chasing of donor contracts, bidding, tendering, looking for whatever had been put out there, basically managing legacy inertia, to becoming agenda setting, to deciding that that was not what we wanted to do. We wanted to set the agenda. We wanted to try and influence the changes that we wanted to see, and put propositions that we wanted others to see that were important for them as well, and work on it together. And this really had to be guided by things that for us mattered the most. So we recentered our strategy around inequality and injustice. Those were the things that we really wanted to tackle. And that had to run across everything, of the very many things, too many, the ODI really did. And make sure that all the various thematic, areas of the organization were, really centered in their work around equity and justice. When the board appointed me as the chief executive in, I think it was end of 2009, it was just before COVID, it was like a month before COVID. This followed a moment where ODI almost went bankrupt and disappeared. Not many people realize how deep the crisis was, but it was really profound. So we almost went bust in 2019. And when they appointed me, I said to them that if they wanted me to accept, I'd obviously done for a year the interim together with another colleague, they had to be comfortable with ODI becoming smaller, not chasing income, not chasing money. I wasn't interested in growth for the sake of growth, definitely not growth in budget, and definitely not growth in staff. So they had to be comfortable that, the organization would become smaller, would contract, but in return, I would offer them a growth in influence and a growth in impact. That's what I wanted to see. Not numbers, it was the influence that mattered. We're a think tank, we need to influence change, not be bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the shift, the board accepted the bet. And so we embarked upon this shift. But, the shift meant very painful decisions. We need to then deliver. We had to shut down a number of long-standing programs. We had to let go of funding streams that, didn't align with this new vision. That meant multi-million pounds consortia that ODI had been managing, I'm sure, with many of you as subcontractors over the years, right? Because, we were the DFID darling, and so they would come to us and give us this massive consortia. And so, of course, our budgets were big because we were managing all these big consortia. So absolutely make a decision they would all go. I still remember the shock of my colleagues. I never believed. There was one program, it's well known, it's called EdTech. We were managing an 18 million pound project, and I went to another partner and said, can you have the prime? Because I don't want the prime. We're not supposed to be the prime. We can't really contribute to the prime. We'll retain 1 million of the 18 million to do the research part. That's where we add value. We can still do some of the work on the research side. And they were, are you sure? There's a lot of margin in this. I don't want the prime. That was one of the first things I did as CEO, which set the tone for a lot of the other things. People understood I was serious. That was, one of many. And, of course, we had to make tough calls on staffing. We redeployed some colleagues, but we also had to part ways with actually very valued and very competent and sort of great colleagues, but it just didn't fit with what ODI was, trying to become. And so over the past 5 years, we went from about 250 staff to about 190. Our overall turnover went from about 40 million to about 32 million, but I think with a lot more purpose. And we had to do a lot of work inside the organization as well. We created space to try and confront questions of power, questions of privilege, questions of legacy about what the Overseas Development Institute was and what ODI was supposed to be. We started training our staff on inclusive practices. We scrutinized space structures to finally achieve gender parity. I could not believe how deep the gender gap was in ODI. We have set the course for ethnic parity. Harder, but at least we have created the foundations for that. And I don't claim for a second that we have changed as deeply as we should, but at least we've charted a journey that we are on as an organization. And of course, we changed our name because we really no longer could possibly be called the Overseas Development Institute. I mean, I was allergic to the name ever since I joined ODI many years ago, but I didn't have the power to change it then. That name was rooted in a post-colonial worldview that it didn't reflect what we were or we needed to become in any way. And so, today we are ODI Global. And today we're not just about analyzing systems, but we're really about trying to shape the systems the way we would like them to see. And of course, all of these changes not happening in a vacuum. We are operating what Adam Tooze called the polycrisis, this chain reaction of shocks that don't respect boundaries, don't respect sectors. We live in a world where these challenges, from climate to the gender rollbacks to democratic backsliding, don't sit in silos anymore. ODI was a very siloed organization. So we had to do the work, and that's some of the hardest part, to try and bring, the silos together. And above all, we no longer live in a world where development is over there, is a global south issue. Our strategy was very clear that this was a universal issue, that it addressed problems in the global north as well as it did in the rest of the world, and perhaps more deeply because we don't want to see them in the global north, so-called. So also this idea that, there are Western models of doing things that could address these problems, it always been a fallacy, but we had to be a lot more intentional and open about the fact that it was that, the paternalism that has imbued a lot of the development enterprise was always out of place. And we needed to be a lot more intentional about, communicating how we felt about it. And so we had to, rethink how and where we engaged. And that's why we created these two small bases in Brussels and in Washington, because we felt we had to be, it was not to plant flags, it was just really to have a little bit of influence where some seats of global power still are, so you need to be more engaged in these conversations there. But we've not done that in any other country, and especially not, on the African continent, because what we're trying to do here is, as Mavis was saying, is actually having much stronger partnerships and make sure that those who come to fund us fund our partners too. Is, creating a base here would be substituting, which would be the last thing that we want to do as ODI Global. Instead, really, we have more than enough like-minded partners that we love working with, and that's what we're trying to promote. We have moved away from research very much being focused on niche areas of researchers that are really passionate about it. And look, I've been a passionate researcher too, but I've realized that that's not how you change things. You can't stick to your very little research niche corner. You need to think systemically. And so that's what we have done. We've moved away from, very much focusing what we wanted to do on this niche research interest to try to tailor research and engagement to influencing key processes. And so, that goes from the G20 to the reform of the MDBs, to the implementation of the AFCFTA, to the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund, supporting the negotiations of the small island developing states, humanitarian reset, you name it. Together with our partners, we're trying to shape fundamental processes of change. Our research needs to support the processes of global change that we are contributing to. And that is starting to bear some fruit. We can see that, we're starting to shift some conversation. We can see that we're starting to, have a much deeper impact than we ever had before. Take the MDBs. We work very closely, with Elizabeth and Mavis, my sisters. We are bringing, equity and, risk-sharing perspectives to conversation that didn't prioritize that. ODI Global in particular is trying to also bring a focus on fragile and conflict-affected states, because that brings, the expertise that we have on the humanitarian side. In Sudan and in Myanmar, as in other countries, but in particular in these two, we've brought out a lot, we really reshaped the narratives about what local responders are doing, showing donors who are so afraid of the fiduciary risks of funding local organizations, how critical their role is, how unique and irreplaceable it is, and really trying to build the confidence of philanthropies for a start, to support mutual aid efforts. And we try now to expand this to bilateral organizations. We're leveraging the fact that we are trusted both locally and, globally by the donors to make sure that this investment finally goes where it should be. And again, we're trying to do this, bringing our complementary value, not substituting, just bringing what we can offer that, can be in addition or, perhaps being some of the glue. But we've also, one big part of doing this has been, first of all, cut down the number of reports we write. When I took over as chief executive, we wrote 650 reports a year. And policy briefs. Yeah, but even now, it's almost 300, okay? So I can look at these two ways. We've made a lot of progress, and my God, we still have a lot of progress to make, right? So we're still, still work in progress. But yeah, you have to convince everyone that your impact is not measured by your report. That even though you're a researcher, I say to my staff, write me one One report of one policy brief each. That's enough, but there has to be that report that really changes the way we look at something. Don't write 10, 12, 15, really don't. Put your energy into bringing one really transformative piece of evidence that can change the narrative. And for the rest, knowledge today is consumed in very different ways. If we really want to influence change, what you need to do is thinking how you channel it. And that's why we've started a fortnightly podcast where, we channel it again. Friends, that many in this room have been hosted on Think Change, our podcast, but also using more, infographics, short videos, Instagram, trying to really channel our evidence in ways where it can reach those who use it. We're also incubating others, sort of startups, organizations that are emerging, because I think there is some creative synergy there. We started when I was leading the humanitarian team, we incubating what was called IRIN, the Integrated Regional Information Network, it was called, which was humanitarian news service of the UN, into what has become the new humanitarian. And I'm really proud of that, because the new humanitarian, it's a fantastic organization. It would not exist if ODI had not taken the risk of incubating, TNH for 3 years and, doing the fiduciary sort of, the accounting basically for them. We're doing the same now with Lago Collective. Lago brings together issues, focuses on issues of migrations, but bringing in culture and arts. So in a very different way. Oh, okay. Oh, I ran. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'll jump about some of the transformation that we made. We can discuss that in the Q&A. But the focus really has been on not, in showing in the spaces that matter, but not telling people what to do. Someone was telling me just the other day from FCDO, I was so sick of being lectured by Overseas Development Institute's lectures, but actually, as partners that co-create. And I just want to level this with you. Just give me an extra couple of minutes. I think this is important because the shift has been hard. It's not been a walk in the park. Changing the business model has meant, confronting some big structural tensions. The old models, the grants, linked to deliverables felt safe. Even though, of course, it was precarious. Of course, creatively it was very limiting. We launched ODI Global Advisory. It's our trading arm that helps us generate unrestricted income that we can then, sort of reinvest into research. But you can imagine the pushback from staff, where commercial equals unethical. And, we deeply diversified our donor base, moving away from sort of very strong dependence from the UK governments. But again, all of these introduce some real tensions, between rigor and speed, between thematic expertise and systems thinking, as I was saying before, between research independence, potentially, depending on how you define it, and, policy access. And I think the part we don't talk about enough is that making the right choices gets harder as the choices get starker. So explaining to your teams why we've let go of legacy programs like agriculture, water, education, kick-as-old program, focus on evaluation, which was, very valued, of course. Why you are declining familiar funding, like this massive consortia. I don't think the colleagues last year wanted me to sign a multi-million program that was granting a lot of African think tanks, which I refused to sign after they're negotiating it, as have forgiven me yet. But it's not an operational conversation, it's a human one, because staff feel disoriented. They ask themselves, where do they fit in this, sort of changing ODI? People worry about their jobs. Some get upset, some resist. And as leaders, you're expected to keep building the plane while you're flying it. The bandwidth to communicate properly every shift, it doesn't always exist. The balance between the external ambition and internal cohesion is constantly in tension. But if there is one thing I have learned, is that if you don't bring your people along, you don't move at all. At the same time, you can't let the dissenting voice paralyze what you're doing. So you need to have the courage to accept that. And that means that, you have to listen even when it's uncomfortable. It means that you have to be honest about the messiness of, how you're trying to make the change. It means that you have to create space, not necessarily for alignment, because this may not come and definitely will not come with all of your stuff, but for doubt, for discomfort, to continually help reassessing that as leaders, you're still moving in the right direction and holding to key values. And inevitably, you'll make mistakes in the process, right? And you'll never persuade everyone that what you're doing is right. But I think the course we've embarked upon has made us a stronger organization. It's made us a freer organization, freer to take risks, freer to speak uncomfortable truths. I mean, we took a very strong position on Gaza. We denounced the genocide very early on, where people were not even touching the issue, and still now are, very muted because of donor pressures or concerns. And so I'll skip on a lot of other things I would have liked to tell you, including the conversation we had last night on decolonization, just to close and say that, I'm sure that a lot of you are confronting similar dilemmas, that you're working, shrinking funding, political pressures, challenges to do more with less. And I'm sure you're reflecting on your model, on your mission, on your value. If there are three things I've learned is, one, you can't reform your structure if you're not rethinking your purpose. That has to be the most important thing. Second, this ambition to be global is as much about humility as it is about reach. You need to know what it is that you can contribute and be very, it's usually just a tiny bit. Be humble about it. And also the letting go, what made you successful in the past may actually be the price of the relevance in the future. So you need to accept that. And you don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to be honest with your staff, with your funders, with your partners, with yourself. You just need to have that purpose really clear, the North Star that guides you. That is the most important thing. And you need to remember that organizational transformation is not linear, it's messy, it's slow, and it hurts. Sometimes it does hurt. But done right, it can help you breathe life into old institutions. It can help you reframe not just what you do, but what you stand for. And so I think at ODI Global, we're still learning, we're still adjusting, we're still evolving, but we are moving with purpose, with conviction. I think we're moving with a renewed sense of what it means to be a radical force for progressive change in everything we do. And sorry I've gone over.